started it? Sure. All right. Welcome everyone to the next session on women's work in India. I hope you enjoyed the last session that we had on globalizing and economic reforms in India. Today we will, it's a bit of a long PPT. Let me share the slides first. Right. What was it? I can put it into this thing mode, right? Yeah. All right. So the issue that we are going to talk about today is women in the workforce and the issues and challenges faced by them in India. I mean, this looks very complicated, but basically, it's what we will focus on. We focus on work and employment. Yes, yes,
Yeah. Speak a little slower. You're not speaking to me and Asta.
Sure. We will focus on work, employment, incomes, and inequality of men and women in the Indian labor market. And then we'll take a period between 2014 and 2017 or 18, within which Indian economy faced two macroeconomic shocks. So one was a shock of demonetization in November 16. That was when demonetization means that suddenly on November 8th, 2016, the government of India declared that some of the high value currency notes of 1,000 rupees and 500 rupees were no longer a currency. So it led to a lot of difficulty, particularly with regard to economic activity. So what we will see is how did this macroeconomic shock affect men and women differently? And then again, followed within like a year and a half, we had the introduction of the GST, which is a goods and services tax. It's a value-added tax, but it is a tax which earlier we had a number of indirect taxes. So they brought them all together under this GST, and there was a particular kind of procedures which had to be followed by businesses to be able to pay these taxes. So that also created a lot of difficulty in the labor market. And again, men and women, large and small businesses, enterprises were affected differently. So these are the two things that we will look at. So the question is, what was the impact of employment and incomes by gender for wage and self-employed people and occupation groups? And what was the impact of these shocks on inequality, that is between men and women, between large business, small business, this kind of inequality? Did it go up? Did it go down? Or what is it? And this is basically the data that I'm using. It is the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy data. And they have a particular survey they do, which they call the Household Consumer Pyramids Survey. But before we go there, we will look at some of the definitions so that we understand when we are saying work, what do we mean? When we say workforce, what do we mean? When we say self-employed and wage-employed, what do we really mean? Because once we get into the economic or rather the data of the slides, there are a series of graphs, and we will be talking about these different categories of workers. So I don't know whether any of you are demographers, but this is very common, commonly explained among demographers and among economists, labor economists. So you have the total population, that is all of us, all ages, everyone. The total population can be divided for our purposes in labor as being participating in the labor force or not participating in the labor force. So the entire population, every single human being, can be categorized as either being in the labor force or outside the labor force. Now, what do we mean by labor force? The labor force consists of two sets of people. One is the people who are actually working, like me, or like all the other professors that you have. So we are part of the workforce. We are defined as workers, working, right? And then you also have a set of people who would like to work, are seeking work, but are not able to get that, those are categorized as unemployed. That is, unemployed are people who currently do not have a job, but who are actively seeking, or in case of India, we even say that even if they are not actively seeking, but are available for work, we consider them as unemployed. So now the labor force consists of this group. That is basically, it is the potential manpower that exists in the country. All the people who are working, and then all the people who would like to work. That is the unemployed. And then you have a large proportion of people who are not working. So who are they? Some of you, for example, students who are not really in the workforce and who are, full-time occupied in being a student. Or there are a set of people, generally women, who are engaged in doing the care work in the household. We're calling them as engaged in domestic work, but basically they are engaged in looking after the children, looking after the old people, their health, cleanliness, cleaning, all the activities that go on at the home, all the activities which allow you and me and all of us to sit here. So it becomes an extremely important activity, in no way to be diminished in its importance, because unless and until we have a set of people who are looking after our needs, we will not be able to be in the workforce. So engaged in domestic work is another category which is outside the labor force. And then you have a set of people who do not earn an income by working, but they may be earning an income other than work. So we call it non-work income. So these are people who have retired, say pensioners, people who are getting a pension after retirement, or they are people who have some kind of asset like a house or land or something, and they give it on rent. So their main income would be rent. Or it could also be that I am a very famous author and I wrote some books. I no longer do that, writing books, but I get the royalty from those books, and that is my non-earned income, non-work income. Or you might get royalty from patents. If you're a scientist, you might have a patent and so on. So that is kind of non-work income. So these people are also considered as currently outside the labor force. And then we have a set of people who are, not necessarily engaged. They're engaged in, according to them, work, but they're categorized as outside the labor force, people who are begging and not productive labor. For some reason, priests are also considered there. So we are going to concentrate on the workforce. That is the people who are employed, because we are interested in understanding the gender differences, the differences between men and women in work, and the issues and challenges that they face because of that. So we will basically be talking about this first left-hand side set of people who are in the workforce. Right. So, so far this is a categorization of the population. That is everybody, whether you're a worker or you're not a worker, whether you're employed or you're unemployed, right? Now, the workforce itself, the people who are workers, they can be categorized in various ways, in different ways. So the one that we are going to pay attention to is what we call the activity status. There is an industry status, there is an occupation status, and so on. But we will concentrate on the activity status. Now, activity status very broadly consists of two kinds of workers. One is those people who are engaged for a wage or for a salary. That's people like me. I'm engaged for a salary, but you might also be engaged. So the ones who are engaged for a salary and have a regular job, so that almost on a regular basis, I am at the university or not at the university, but still working for the university. That is a regular salaried work. For example, a professor in the university. The other kind of wage and salaried workers are those who are getting their income in terms of wages, but on a very casual basis. That is, they are sometimes working and sometimes not. Sometimes they're able to find work and sometimes they're not able to find work. They're unemployed. So these are, and they're paid on a daily basis or weekly basis. but they do not get a regular income, like a regular monthly salary. They do not get that. So these people are called casual workers. So you can well imagine that the people who are casual workers are much more vulnerable because it is not clear to them whether on any particular day they will get work or not. And then they are paid either on a daily basis, or they're paid in terms of a piece rate, in the sense that you do this much of work for me and I'll pay you this per piece. So garment workers could be casual workers on piece rate. That is, if they make this particular cloth, then a particular dress or something, I'll charge you, I'll give you some rate, which will be a piece rate. So that's casual workers. So the first group, broad group, are wage and salaried workers, and the other group are self-employed. Now, what is the main difference between these people? The wage and salaried workers, in the case of wage and salaried workers, you can clearly identify who the person is working for. So there is an employer-employee relationship. So I am an employee. Who's my employer? The university. Ahmedabad University is my employer. So there is a clear employer-employee relationship between me and the university. And that is the reason why I am categorized as a wage or salaried worker. Even in the case of casual work, even if they are working on a daily basis, there is a clear relationship between the employer and the employee, in the sense that the person who is working as a construction worker, even if he is being paid a daily wage, he knows for sure who his employer is. So there is a direct relation between the employer and the employee. So that is casual, that is wage and salary employed. In the case of a self-employed person, these people are working on their own. They are basically, they have their own enterprises and they're doing some form of business, maybe big business, small business, it may be, a casual business, it may be a seasonal business or whatever, but these are the people who are self-employed. And even within the self-employed, there can be broadly divided into three types of people within the self-employed. So one is, both the employer and the own account worker, the first two categories, are actually owners of that enterprise. Okay, an enterprise could be a small manufacturing unit. So a manufacturing unit of garments, or a manufacturing unit of some small plastic items, or even a big one. So if the person, what is the difference between employer and own account worker? If the person is owning an enterprise and hiring workers to work for them on a regular basis, that person is an employer. So this employer in a small manufacturing enterprise can hire regular workers, like he can hire a chartered accountant, he can hire an engineer, or he can also hire this casual worker. That is, he might have some work to be done, not on a regular basis. Suppose he gets a very big contract to manufacture whatever he's manufacturing. Then he might employ a few people on a daily wage rate to do part of that work. So that is an employer. He owns an enterprise and he also hires workers on a regular basis, at least one worker on a regular basis. So he's an employer. The other self-employed person is also owning an enterprise, but he basically works himself and with the help of his family members. So his wife might work with him, his children, his uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, whoever. So that is an own account worker. That is a family-owned and operated enterprise. Right? So the difference between the employer and the own account worker is the employer hires people on a regular basis from outside, workers, and the own account worker mainly works depending on himself and his family workers. Now these contributing family workers are the people who are working in this own account enterprise, or even for this employer. That is, you have an enterprise, but say your wife works or somebody else works, and you don't really pay them on a regular basis, but they get the gains of whatever profits you make. So, you don't necessarily give them an income, but they get their food, shelter, clothing, whatever their needs are, comes out of this. So they are the so-called unpaid family workers. So the broader category only we will worry about in this lecture, who are the wage and salaried workers and the self-employed workers. The reason, so the self-employed worker does not have a clear, he doesn't have to have an employer. He himself is the owner and operator of his business, right? So these kind of people can be differently affected by a shock, like the two shocks that we were talking about, either demonetization when the currency is removed from the economy, or if there is a new tax system which comes into play. These businesses and the wage and salaried workers can be affected differently. Definitely, our issue is gender. So definitely men and women are affected differently, and which is what the story we are going to see for the Indian economy over a short period of time, right? So these are the classifications that, because once we get into the graphs and we see self-employed and wage employed and so on, we should be able to understand who exactly are we talking about, right? All right, this is just only take a look at this left-hand side, the graph on the leftmost graph, which is the female labor force participation rate. This is a set of Asian countries. We have China, which is right on top. So what I want to show is that how the women's labor force participation in India is low. I'm going to show you later on how low it is, but then how low it is, you will really understand only if you see it in comparison with some other country. And since China is the country that we are comparing with, you can see that almost 80% of the women are working. They are in that category which I call the workforce. Or the labor force, that is either they're working or they're unemployed, right? Here it is the labor force participation rate. So what is this labor force participation rate? It is all the people who are workers plus the people who are unemployed, right? So China is right on top. And where is India? India is this square, it's called legends, right? So it is like less than 40%. And it is lower than all the other countries except Pakistan. So this lowest blue one with these crosses is Pakistan. And except for Pakistan, India has very low labor force. The other countries here are, I think, Korea and China, Indonesia, and Korea. You can see that here. So India, female labor force participation is very low. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that female labor force participation has been declining in India very sharply, particularly since 2004. And that in some sense is true for China as well, right? The other countries are not having this kind of a declining labor force participation. So one of the big puzzles in India that we talk about all the time is, one, why is this labor force participation so low? And there are many, many explanations for that. Many, many papers are written on that. And the other thing is, why is it declining? It's already low. And why is it declining? We will not really go into the causes for all of this now, but these are some of the issues which rise. And here I just wanted to show you how low, if I tell you that 40% of the women are working, it doesn't make any difference to you. But if I tell you that in China, 80% of the women are making, then it's extremely striking. You can see very clearly that the workforce participation of women is very low in India, and you'll see that even more so. So this is just to get a broad idea. This is female workforce participation. Okay, so this is only including the workers and not the unemployed in India, in rural and urban areas. This is all ages, that is from whatever 5 years to or 15 years to above, right? So here you can see a difference between women's work in between 2004-5. So if you go back to this slide, the sharp decline is really from 2004-5, and that is true. I don't know what data this graph is coming out of the Asian Development Bank report, right? It's written there, and they are using the International Labour Organization data and the World Bank data here. All right, but this is our own data. This data is coming from the National Sample Survey Organization, which is our official Ministry of Statistics, collects data on But since 2017-18, we have data on the labor force every year. Now, there are two things that I want to point out here. One is that workforce participation in rural areas is almost always higher. Female labor force participation in rural areas is almost always higher than urban labor force participation. So overall, we have a low labor force participation, but labor force participation in urban areas is extremely low. It is, around 10 to 15% at the all India level. The other significant thing between rural and urban is that rural workforce participation shows much more fluctuation than the urban. So you first see this huge drop, and then in the more recent labor force rounds of after 17-18, it has sort of stabilized. It's not very clear how or why, but you see this kind of a fluctuation. Whereas if you look at the urban female labor force participation, it's more or less steady. Of course, you still see a small rise and a small fall and so on, but it's more or less steady. So even though in urban areas in India, you have much fewer women working, their work participation is more stable. They remain in the workforce over periods of time rather than fluctuating the way the rural areas are fluctuating. Now, what's the reason for that? The reason for that is in rural areas, it is mainly agriculture. And so the majority of the women, more than 60% of the workforce itself in rural areas are engaged in agriculture. And agriculture in India, in major parts of the country, is dependent on the rainfall. We don't have 100% irrigation in all the agricultural fields in India. Some parts of the country have good irrigation and the rest of them don't have. And some parts of the country get very good rainfall and the rest of it does not. Most of the country does not get very good rainfall, as we will see the differences in female labor force participation across states in the next couple of slides. So that is the reason why there is more fluctuation in the rural workforce participation than in the urban. So this kind of an extraneous thing like rainfall does not quite affect the urban women's work. And that's the reason for that. Okay. The other striking thing about India is that the workforce participation differences across the states of India. So you know that India is a large country, and like you in China have provinces, we have states, and we have like 30 odd states. So here I'm showing you and broadly, if I have categorized the states into states which are in the north of India, in the south of India, and there's another slide here, east of India and the west of India. Now, we will see huge labor force participation differences across these regions. So if you compare, now this is rural South India on top left, on the right top is urban South Indian states, and the lower two graphs are North Indian states, rural, and on the right hand side, urban. So if you look at this, just the absolute value. So in rural workforce participation in the southern states, so there are these 4 states, the names of these states are Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Kerala. So this topmost one, which has more than 50% of the women working in the beginning, is Andhra Pradesh. And this one with the lowest here is Kerala. So if you compare it with the north, the highest labor force participation they have is close to 30%, and that is in Haryana. And this state of Haryana also sees a very sharp, this brown line, a very, very sharp fall in the female labor force participation. So the south states, broadly, if you were to take all this together, you'll see a much higher, some average of this. So overall, like these 3 states, which is Andhra, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, have high labor force participation rate. So here the average labor force participation rate was around 20 or 25 or 30. And here the average labor force participation rate is closer to 40. So that is the kind of difference. And that difference is maintained, though you can see that declining labor force participation since 2004-5 that we saw in that first international graph that I showed you. That is true when you look at the national data as well. You see this declining between 2004-5 up to 17-18, and then it kind of stabilizes a bit. So the main thing I wanted to show you is this stark difference in the level of workforce participation rate among states. So while we say that workforce participation of women is low, there are certain states like this, we'll see this southern states, and also in the western states, we'll see this, where the workforce participation rate of women is much higher. Same thing is true. So overall, urban rates of workforce participation of women is lower than that of urban. That you can very clearly see here, whether it is a South Indian state or whether it is a North Indian state. The workforce participation here is like urban South India has 20% and rural South India has 40. If you look at it here, urban northern states has 10%, and here urban northern states has like 20%. The other thing that we saw earlier was that the urban rate over time is more stable. It's kind of maintains a thing. Of course, there is a fluctuation, but it is more or less stable, unlike the rural ones, which are falling. Like I said, again, the reason why rural fluctuates a lot more is because the majority of the people are working in agriculture, and this agriculture is dependent on the rainfall, and now with climate change, rainfall has become even more erratic. I mean, it comes certain years, don't come certain years. Certain years it's just too heavy. If it is too heavy, also there is a problem because then the crops are destroyed and so on. So that's the difference between rural and urban. So the southern states have higher workforce participation rates than the northern ones. And you'll see the same thing between the western states and the eastern states. So these on top are the eastern states and these are the western states. Sorry for the size. The eastern state, the eastern states actually have lower labor force participation than the western states. The western states, if you look at this, an average, you can say 50% of the women are working. But here, if you see, there's a wide variation, but on average, you can say only about 25% of the eastern states women are working. So these states like Bihar, Orissa, Jharkhand, West Bengal, they have women are less likely to come out into the workforce. The same difference between rural and urban in both eastern states. Urban participation is always a lot lower than rural participation, and urban participation tends to be a little more stable than rural participation. Now, why are southern states and western states having higher labor force participation? There are many, many reasons they give for this. So let's just first think about the South and the North. The southern states, one of the reasons they gave is that the southern states have a rice cultivation. They have more water and they have more rice cultivation. And as compared to the northern states, which is more wheat dominated. It's not that they don't have rice. They definitely have rice as well, particularly in those areas which are highly irrigated, are well irrigated, because you need a lot of water. All of you should know that as you eat rice. You're mainly rice eaters, but we in India, a very large percentage of our population are wheat eating people, cereals, we consumers wheat. So one of the difference is that the rice cultivation, more women participate in rice cultivation because of the kind of operations they have. The rice is transplanted. So women engage in that transplanting. That is, they have these small seedlings and they stand in this wet ground, and you must have all seen it. They put it in the thing. So you bend over and you're standing there for ages, and they do a lot of weeding and so on. And because of this, even harvesting is done less through machines and it's more manual. A lot of activities in rice cultivation are done manually and done by women. Whereas the northern thing has much less of need for women to participate in the labor force. That's one of the reasons that they give. The other reason is, of course, something to do with our culture. The northern states were the states which faced the invasion from foreign, because you see the southern states, like yesterday, in last week I showed you the map of India, and you have this peninsular region, which is surrounded by the ocean. That is a southern state. The southern states, historically, during the colonial times and before that, were not invaded. People came to the southern states mainly to trade. They came in peace. The Portuguese, many, so the Spanish and the Portuguese, we have Portuguese colonies here in India, in South and in Goa and so on, and even the Chinese came to trade. But from the north, we had invasion mainly from the Mughals. And so the Mughal Empire, which was there before the colonial masters in India. So at that point in time, that created a situation where the women were, we call it put under parda, under a veil, in the sense to protect the women. They followed a custom of covering their faces and covering their heads, and generally they were secluded. So that seclusion of women that took place in the northern states did not happen in the southern states. The southern states don't really, the women in the southern states don't cover their head, don't cover their faces. So generally the mobility outside the house for women in the south is much more than mobility outside the house for women in the north. This is a very general statement, but unfortunately, this was a cultural kind of practice which existed from a long time ago. And fortunately or unfortunately, to some extent, it continues, and that affects the capacity of these women to come out and work. Yes, Tejaswi.
So I was a little surprised to see the figures of Western India, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and I forgot the fourth one. Yeah,
Chhattisgarh.
Chhattisgarh is not exactly Western anyway. But I was surprised that the Western India figures, which include Rajasthan, which would also have faced invasion by the Mughals, has a higher rate of participation.
Yeah, you're right. So here the explanation that one can give is the nature of the agriculture and the nature of the region. So all these regions, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Chhattisgarh, are semi-arid. That is, they receive very low rainfall, and they are generally, of course, Gujarat and Maharashtra, we can't say are poor, but they still have large tracts of land which are extremely, are semi-arid. They hardly get any rain, and to that extent, also having higher levels of poverty. So one of the reasons given for, of course, now that Maharashtra and Gujarat have evolved so much, it's difficult to say that. But basically, Rajasthan, actually, we have Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh go. Okay, doesn't matter. 1, 2, 3. Yes, there is a Madhya Pradesh. Sorry. There is a Madhya Pradesh because there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, and I've got only 4 here. I'm sorry. Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh are very similar to each other. As you know, it was one state before, and then they split into Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And Rajasthan. These are semi-arid regions. So if you look at this one on the top, this is actually Chhattisgarh. And the next one would really be Madhya Pradesh. And this one down here is Maharashtra. And Gujarat is in between. So Chhattisgarh, which is the most semi-arid region, and also we should have Madhya Pradesh. Now I can't, I've got that wrong here, are states which are semi-arid, and somehow there are also these tribal belts over here. Along that Western Ghats, you have the tribal belts. Both in all these regions, you have tribal belts. Tribal women again have fewer restrictions on them than the non-tribal women. So also because they were forest-based and less agriculture-based and so on. So this is not a story that has been settled, but I just wanted to broadly point out that there are these very, very stark differences. So that if we just say that women's labor force participation in India is low, it is low. But there are regions where the women's labor force participation can be very high. And then the reasons are, again, there are different reasons why they might be high in some states and not so in. So I don't want to give the idea that, everything is very homogeneous and all over India, you have very low labor force participation rates. But few things are for sure. Urban areas have lower labor force participation rates than rural areas. And also we have been having this declining labor force participation in rural areas mainly up to 2017-18. After that, there seemed to be some improvement. But that does not necessarily hold for the urban areas. Urban areas tend to be much more, stable, and in some cases also having a rising labor force participation. Basically, jobs and good jobs are more available in, okay, sorry, I was just looking at the chat. All right, so that is just an introduction to what are the different kinds of work categories, which is what we talked about first, wage employed and self-employed, and so on. And then what is a broad picture of workforce participation in India, all right, and how it has changed over time, how they are different across the states and geographies in India, and how they are different across rural and urban areas. So that's a broad introduction to workforce participation rate. Now we come into the nitty-gritty of the changes that took place between 2014 and 2018. And this is using this CMI data. The earlier one was using the national data, the labor force government data, the labor force survey of the Ministry of Statistics. This is a private agency called the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. The advantage they have is that they produce data on a monthly basis. So because they produce it on a monthly basis, if you want to study something like this, okay. Now, what is this red line? This red arrows here is indicating around November 2016 when the event of demonetization took place. So November 8th, 2016 is when demonetization took place. So because this data is monthly data, we can actually track what was happening to employment and wages on a monthly basis. You can track many other things, but we are interested in income, wages, and employment. So, and this yellow line here is when the second economic shock that hit us, which was the introduction of this new indirect tax system called the Goods and Services Tax, called it GST, down here. So July 2017 is when they introduced the GST. This green thing I've just shown to show that this is the point where you are actually seeing it decline. The sharp decline didn't actually happen with demonetization or with the introduction of GST. The sharp decline the decline had already started. Again, as you can see, for urban areas, this is work participation in rural and urban areas. Overall, urban labor force participation is low. And the reason for that is, of course, the women's labor force participation. This is both men and women. This is all workers. You see here on top. It's all workers. So overall, because of the very low female labor force participation in urban, if you put men and women workforce participation together, urban areas will all show a lower labor force participation than rural areas. All right. So you see this kind of a steady thing up till July. In urban areas, even in rural areas. And then around April, July 16, that is before the event of demonetization, the decline in labor force participation started. And then there were the sharp declines when the two shocks hit us. Now you'll see a lot of variation in this, and this is what we're going to see. And we're going to look at it for male, female. Then we're going to start looking at it for wage employed and self-employed. And then we'll split up the wage employed into white collar workers and other lower level workers. And then we will also split up the self-employed or the businesses into large businesses and small business. So this is the overall picture. Now we're going to start disaggregating this into male, female, wage employed, self-employed, within wage employed into white collar workers, which is the better off workers, the kind of salaried workers and other workers. And we'll separate the self-employed or the businesses into large businesses and small businesses. And this data set allows us to do this. So we'll see how these two events of demonetization and of introduction of this, they were really done very suddenly. It was not previously known that they're going to withdraw currency like this with demonetization. It was really not known. There was a lot of talk about GST, but exactly when they were going to implement it was not very well known. So the businesses took some time to adjust to this. And then large businesses and small businesses had different capacity to be able to adjust to the new sales tax system, the goods and services tax. So that made a difference to their incomes and to employment in these. Right. Right. So what we saw earlier was just rural and urban. Now we will be looking only at the urban workforce participation rate, and this is workforce participation rates of male, male and female in urban areas. So this bottom line with these what are these triangles is female labor force participation rate, and this one right on top is male labor force participation rate. So like I said, male labor force participation rate is very close to the international labor force participation rates for men, workforce participation rates for men. So like almost 75% of the men are engaged in the in employment, in work. And this, like I said, urban participations are very low. So like 11.2 or something like that percentage women were in the labor force. And this line in the middle is the average, the men and women together, all Indian. So here you don't see that the sharp differences, but you can see July 16 is the July 2016 is when they start, when the decline starts. And November 16 is when we had the the demonetization. And you see this slightly declining labor force participation, even in for men and more so for women. So women had declined from 12 to 9%. From here it declined from 73 to 70%. Declining female labor force participation was, however, observed before the demonetization event. Declining male labor force participation really started to show up only in July, right? So this is again a broad thing of, just like we saw, this was rural and urban. And here you can see it looks more sharp, but it's really the same in terms of percentage points. It will be almost the same. And this is the male-female. Unemployment rates generally are like the opposite of the employment rates. So if female labor force participation was falling like this, then its unemployment, female unemployment rose very, very sharply as compared to male unemployment. Male unemployment, or let me say that unemployment rates, the way we define it in India, is very low. So generally we just have 3% unemployed or 4% unemployed, which is really very low. It's almost like not having unemployment, because we are defining this as open unemployment. That is, people who have no work to do and are available for work. What happens in India is that we have a very large amount of self-employment, and we also have a lot of people who are relatively poor. So what we say about open unemployment is that people cannot really afford to remain unemployed in that open fashion. So they just take up some kind of activity that they can possibly take up. Mainly what they do is they buy something and then they sell it. So you buy it a little cheaper and then you sell it. So that is kind of informal sector activities which happen. But people do that in order to survive. So open unemployment, so if you ask anybody, most of the people are actually working. So only we really see a very small proportion of people. So if we see this kind of an increase to 6% and 8% and so on, then that's a huge amount of increase for us. Again, the time when we had this is during the pandemic, because during the pandemic, exactly what happened in demonetization happened in pandemic. We have that data also, but I didn't want to confuse the issue too much. So basically, even before the demonetization, in July itself, the unemployment rate had become really very high. It drops a little bit, and then again with demonetization, you see it going up. Female unemployment rate was urban was very, very high, but you can also see that there was a sharp increase in male unemployment rates, which is this bottommost line. Basically, it is the opposite of what is happening to the employment. Okay, so here we are talking about that split. Remember, we said that workers can be either wage employed or salaried employed and self-employed. So here we are looking at the difference in participation as wage employed workers or self-employed workers. So you have these ones on the top. This topmost thing is female wage employment. So this is the proportion of women who are wage employed in urban areas, proportion of women, total women who are self-employed. So majority of the women are in overall women participation is low, all right, only 10%. So out of the 10% people, 90% of them are engaged in some kind of wage employment. Only about 10% of them are engaged in self-employment, right? Whereas if you look at the men, this is the male wage employment and this is the male self-employment, okay? So if you take all the men, then a little more than 65% are engaged in wage employment, and that the rest of them, which is 35%, is engaged in self-employment. That is how you read this data. So it is women, if all women workers is equal to 100, then what percentage are engaged in wage and salary and what percentage are engaged in self-employment. Similarly, for men, if you take all the men equal to 100, then what percentage are included in self-employment and what percentage. So some broad things can be said here, that women, when they work, are more likely to be in urban areas, are more likely to be engaged either as a wage worker, it's mostly wage work and very little of salaried employment, and much less having their own businesses, right? Whereas men, as men are concerned, they could be in either wage employment or self-employment. Now, what happened to wage and self-employment over this period of time? So if you look at wage employment, you can see that the wage employment is declining both for men and for women. So it was already declining, but then after the November event of the demonetization, you see this further decline and male wage increase declines, and the self-employment is going up both for men and women. For women, it is very low, but so what was for men self-employment, what was a very steady thing at about 40% up to November 2016, slowly starts to go up. So what is this? This is some kind of a reaction that as they lose their wage employment, they are entering into some kind of self-employment. As we go along, we find that in the case when this kind of a shock happens, either demonetization or later on the pandemic, the men are able to adjust themselves into some other activity. So while the wage employment is falling, their self-employment is going up. Here, wage employment is falling and self-employment is going up apparently, but not to the extent that it would. So mostly the men are able to adjust. Women are also adjusting according to this. If you look at it from the eye, this is just a visual presentation of this. So broadly, with the shocks that came, it was the wage and salary people were more likely to lose their. It's not that all of them lost their job, obviously not, because it was like 90%, here it is 80%, and it has come down to 70%. So almost like 10%, 10 percentage points or 8 percentage point people have lost their jobs among women, and almost the same among men. They lost their jobs, that is wage or salaried jobs. And the makeup that they have done is by increasing self-employment. And this particular pattern of this declining wage employment and increasing self-employment is also visible in the National Sample Survey data, which we are not using here, but you can see that kind of thing. So wage and salaried lost and self-employed rose, and the trends became sharper after the GST. Now, in July 2017, we had the new tax regime. And after that tax regime, more of the wage employment people seem to have lost their jobs. And large businesses have, male businesses still did pick up. All right, so now this is a graph which is a little bit more confusing. So here we have separated, I thought I got rid of agriculture. Yeah. So here we have the self-employed businesses and wage employed people. So the wage employed people here we have separated into the white collar workers and the wage workers. So this topmost graph here is wage in non-agriculture. Now this is not by gender. This is by gender. So this is just the broad aggregate. So, okay, let us just look at the ones which are going down. So the ones which are going down, and this is the event of demonetization. This red, the red arrows is the event of demonetization. This yellow arrow is the event of the new tax regime, GST. All right. So this is July 2017. This is November 2016. So let's see who's losing out. So here we had the wage non-agricultural. Wage meaning it is more like manual labor and lower level factory workers and so on. White collar are the ones which are, salaried employed. So overall salaried employment was constant, but both salaried employment, the topmost line is wage employment, and which is more like manual, casual, and so on. And the second line is white collar workers. So you find that the decline is for both the white collar workers and for the wage employed, but more striking for the wage, non-agricultural wage employment, right? And if you look at the other thing, we have the businesses. We have split into large business and small business. So here you can see this slide. These are the small businesses which were growing very, very rapidly before demonetization. And after demonetization, they kind of stabilize and sort of fall more after the GST. So small businesses were, and this squared line is the large businesses. So overall, we were seeing a growth of self-employment in small businesses, and the large businesses were declining. But after the shock of demonetization and the other shock of the GST, it is the small businesses that started to stagnate, and the big businesses were picking up. So you see this particularly after GST. You see the big businesses seem to adjust. Now we will try to explain why that is. Basically, the thing is that when there is a shock, when there is an economic shock, enterprises will try to get rid of as many people as they can so that they can become profitable. So in that process, the wage workers are the first ones to lose their jobs, because they are most probably the most replaceable. They are the people who are less skilled, and they are more replaceable. So the wage workers lose their jobs. And then after the higher level workers, which are the salaried workers, they lose their jobs as well. Maybe not to that extent. So wage and white collar jobs lost, and the trend became sharper after the introduction of this new system of GST. The self-employed businesses, which were like doing okay, they started to were growing. They started to stagnate again after July 2017, and the self-employed businesses began to rise. So the chances are that the self-employed businesses were better able to adjust to the new tax regime, which is quite understandable, because getting into that new tax regime was a very complicated business, because the entire thing was online, and most of the small businesses were transacting on cash, and they really didn't have online presence in that sense. And it was a complicated process, which really required a high level, say a chartered accountant or a high level professional to be able to manage that, to register for the goods and services tax, and to be able to follow the procedures which were required for that. Small businesses suffered because of that. Large business had more capacity to be able to adjust to the new system. So you see the collapse of the small, and which is the reason why you see this shift in the proportion of self-employed people in large businesses and small businesses. Now, if you look at the women and men, so these are the wage workers alone. All right. These are people who get wages, the real wages. So these are wages. This is employment. Okay, people who have jobs and don't have jobs. This is those people who have jobs. What are the wages that they're getting? Okay, so this is wages, and wages plus the bonus income in white collar jobs and normal wage jobs. So white collar jobs are the better off jobs, mostly the salaried jobs, and the wage workers are the ones who get the lower salary or wages. They might even be the casual workers. So let's see who's right on top. who's right on top are the white collar male workers. So this is rupees per month. So our average salaries are pretty low. So the average for a white collar worker is close to 14,000. It is not in the range of lakhs. Yes.
So I have a clarification. Just in case the students, from China are unable to understand the term white collar, I don't know if it is used in other parts of the world.
Okay.
You give some examples of what is a white collar job.
Yeah. So white collar jobs are, even my job is a white collar job. White collar jobs are generally salaried workers working in offices or working from home, or so clerical jobs are also white collar jobs. All professionals are white collar jobs. All associated professionals, that is technical people. People as a lab assistant, or in the health sector, you have a lot of people who do the X-rays and who do they call paramedical staff. So all that, so it is a higher level. So you have the professionals, then you have the associated professionals. That is, okay, you have a professor, but then you'll have a teaching assistant, or you'll have a research assistant. They are the associated professionals. And then you have sales workers. Even sales workers will come under the white collar jobs. And then you have manual. So the majority of the people in India are manual workers and sales related workers, clerical workers. But clerical people would be in the white collar. So wage non-agricultural is basically manual, not necessarily manual. They call it, shop floor work. It's not manual. People who work in the factories, they're not doing manual work. They are working with machines. So they are what are called the workers, or in India, we call them fourth class and third class employees. So the people who do the sweeping and cleaning over here, they are all fourth class employees. The peons, I don't know how there's a concept of peon. No, there's no concept of peon in China. So a peon is a handyman. Okay, we have a lot of them in this office. So basically what they do is they are given tasks like, okay, carry this around, or whatever tasks are required. They sit in the office and they do all that, including bringing tea for some of the senior officers and so on. So basically they are showing the difference in the education levels, which then the white collar workers are the ones who are more educated and have higher levels of salaries. And the wage workers are the ones who are generally less educated and are either factory workers, shop floor workers, or they are, people who are manual workers in construction work, or any other kind of wage related workers, that they're getting a wage. So this is basically showing the difference in the income levels, and that income level differences is reflecting the differences in the education levels as well. Right? So the white collar workers are the better off set of wage workers that we have in India. But when you see this, this over time, there is the wages. We saw, if you look at the employment, there is a decline in employment in white collar workers after all these shocks. There is a decline in employment among wage workers as well. But if you look at their incomes, if you look at the incomes, after July 16 and November 16, there is a sharp increase in the incomes of white collar male workers. This one right on top is white collar male workers. White collar female workers is the next, this brown one. So while their wages were stationary, after the shock, the number of workers, the proportion of workers who were white collar and wage workers went down, self-employed went up, but the salaries of these people, or the monthly incomes of these people actually went up. What does it mean? It basically means that the people with lower level salaries were probably the ones that were kicked out, because the people with the lower level jobs are the most dispensable. You can get rid of them. So if I have 3 people coming here to clean my table, I don't need them, right? So if my business is not doing very well, I'll first get rid of all those people. that I don't need, if I have a, a very low level person who's doing some typing job for me, I'll just say, okay, I can manage without this person. So you can go and I'll do my own typing, right? Or I'll get somebody else in my office to do that, right? So you just get rid of the lower level workers. And in that situation where the lower level jobs have been got over, the mean wages of the higher level people who are still there in the job, who have not lost their job, their mean salaries are going up. It's not like because there was an economic shock, my salary went up. My salary didn't go up. But on average, when you take the total number of people that you have, the salaries of these people then was going up, and very sharply. And anyway, this is also a kind of inequality that is existing in India, where the highly qualified people are getting exceptionally high jobs and increasing at a very fast pace, whereas the lower level workers are getting low and the increase is very minimal for them. And this last two at the bottom are the wage workers. So the wage workers also saw a slight increase. The ones that gained the least is, of course, the women wage workers. So these are the women who are, either doing sweeping, cleaning jobs, or who are, coming to the office and doing this. Or even if you go to you go to the hospitals over here, you see a lot of women who are, we call them ayers, basically, which means, again, they do sweeping, cleaning jobs. So there are all kinds of, lower level activities that need to be performed even in a hospital. So they might stand by the side of the doctor, or so. Okay, so if a woman patient goes into the hospital, then whether there is a male doctor or a female doctor, there will always be an assistant lady who is what we would call an ayah. So she would be this kind of, she might even be a daily wage worker, or she might be a very low level salaried worker. So she will come under this, that category of workers who are this set of people who are these wage workers. So those kind of people were the ones that they were able to get rid of. So this one right on top is wage in non-agriculture. The sharpest fall is among them, and the lowest increase in wages is among them. So basically, when a business or when an economy comes under a shock, the incomes of the whole country falls. Even the GDP will fall because of the fact that there's less income. So in the case of demonetization, it was a big problem because all the money went away from the system. So many of the small businesses actually collapsed because they operated on cash and they lost tremendously because all their cash became irrelevant. So, what we're seeing here is that wage and salary jobs were lost, and this is the job one. These are the incomes, right? So the two incomes that we look at right on top are the white collar workers. What is happening now? This is the employment. Sorry, we were looking at this. All right, and the last two at the bottom. So this one is looking at, so this graph is looking at incomes of wage and salaried workers, or that regular workers and casual workers. And we've separated them into these so-called white-collar workers, which, okay, if we want to use our old terminology, we can call them regular salaried workers. And the others were the wage workers. But the wage workers in this case are not necessarily people who are only getting a daily wage. They may be other people, but at the lower level of lower level means in terms of skill. The lower skilled jobs are what I'm calling these lower level jobs. So overall, the lower level jobs were lost, and the mean wages of the higher white collar jobs went up. And then again, you can see. So now look at this. This widening difference between the male and the female. So this is the male work rise, right? And this is the female work. This white collar, this green one is the male white collars, and this brown one here is the female white collars. Similarly, this one on top is the male wage workers, and these are the female wage workers. So while there was a rise for both, the difference between the male and female wages was increasing. So there was an increasing wage gap between the male and the female white collar workers, and less so for the female. So you see this difference. So while the wages were similar in the beginning, from 12,000 to like 14,000, now the male workers are getting on average closer to 18, 19,000 a month rupees, and the women are getting closer to 12,000 rupees a month. So this difference between these two rose very sharply after all these various events of shock that we had in the economy. The difference between the male and female, this thing also. So overall, if you look at it, over time, the male and female wages have been, the gap between them has been declining. But when the economy was injected with these two shocks, of macroeconomic shocks, advantage that the female wages, females had got in terms of narrowing wages, that started to go up again. So here you have this. There could be many reasons for this. One of the reasons could simply be that all the higher level male workers were retained and higher level female workers were thrown out. Anything is possible, because that gender bias that comes into this, and also because the women they may be having higher incomes, but they would still have lower levels of qualifications than the men. So when a shock comes, what the company will do, okay, if there is a shock in this, if we get fewer workers, let me give you a very clear example. Take the University of Ahmedabad University. If tomorrow, instead of 1,000 students in 1 year, we get only 600 students, what will happen? I will not be fired, because I'm at the higher level professor and they need that. But the lower level, the junior level staff will get fired. So they will get rid of all their extra administration. So mostly administration will get fired, because we can live without that administration. If we have 3 people in one admissions office, we can get rid of 3 and have only 1. But you can't get rid of the professors, because the professors still have to teach. Unless, of course, there's a massive decline in students. If there's a massive decline in students, then the professors will also lose their jobs. But basically what I'm saying is that higher qualified workers are more valuable to the company, particularly if they're doing the core job. So like every industry has a core job. If it is an automobile industry, then making that car is the core job. Everything else is peripheral. So here, what is the main job? Main job is teaching students. Anybody who's not teaching children is a peripheral. So when a shock comes, every industry will try to understand which are the people that we absolutely need. We can't run this. And most often, those people that they most absolutely need will be the ones who have slightly higher salaries. And the chances are that they are more likely to be men than women. So that is how you see this kind of a sort of increasing gap between the men and the women, because all the lower salaried females are thrown out. So their salaries start to go down. The higher level males are retained. The salaries of those workers start to go up. And the same may be true in the wage thing, but it's less easy to explain than to explain the widening gender gap in white collar jobs. So male and female also rose, but so this is one striking difference between men and women in wage jobs. A similar difference we'll see between small businesses and large businesses, and between female businesses and male businesses. So this is the self-employed category, which we are calling business now. So basically, they are all enterprises undertaking some kind of entrepreneurial. Even a person who sells food on the street vendor, that is also an enterprise. Okay, that is also a business. All right, it's a small business. That's called a small business. The larger businesses are the big factories or the big whatever owned by men and women. So here we are separating by gender, male, female, just like in the earlier version, in the earlier one also. Here it is male and female, wage and white collar. Here it is male and female, small businesses and large businesses. All right. So let's look at the one on the top. What is this thing on the top? Again, it is male, self-employed businesses. These are the large businesses. And where are the small businesses? The small businesses are this thing. Here, there's this huge increase after the demonetization, and then it starts to decline after GST. And you can see that the large businesses are doing very well after GST. This is actually the, these are the mean incomes.
Yeah. I just want to say that if you come to a natural pause somewhere, we can take a little break.
Yeah, what is the time? Let's just wait for a little longer, then I'll get tea as well. All right. So the natural thing will come when we go for when that inequality thing comes. All right. So this is the same as we looked at in the earlier one, and the results are almost the same as well. So these are, So the one right on top is male large businesses. The brown one is female large businesses, and the two lines underneath are the bottommost is male small businesses and female small businesses. Right. So this is a very interesting thing, is that the male self-employed large businesses started to grow, or rather they did well after the demonetization a little bit, and then after the GST. So it basically means that they were able to hold on to their businesses more. They were able to adjust to the new situation of the new taxes and registration for them, and being able to operate within that system than the small businesses. So if you look at the male small businesses, they were not all that active before. And then during demonetization, they were doing okay. And then after the GST, they start to decline. And that's true for the female this thing also. So it is the female self-employed large businesses also did all right after GST. So here you have these people, they are getting this, we are talking about incomes, okay? So 15,000 per month or whatever is the incomes that they are receiving, and these women were receiving 10,000. You see again that little bit of a variation. The males moved up faster than the females, but it's not as much. That difference between male and women is not as striking as it was for the, it's got stuck, as it was here. So this gap which increases between men white collar and female white collar, that kind of a gap is increasing here also, but not to that extent. The difference for the female is that there's a huge amount of fluctuation, whereas the male thing is more or less steady. Whatever is happening to them, it's more or less steady. This means there's a lot of in and out for these businesses, for these women businesses. But overall, the larger businesses did all right. Now, the female smaller businesses, somehow after demonetization, they seem to have survived. And then it is when the new tax regimes come that they seem to be losing out somewhere along. So male self-employed large business income rose sharply after demonetization and the new tax regime of GST. Male small businesses rose after, small businesses did okay after demonetization, but the very small ones probably dropped out. But small business incomes dropped and stagnated after GST. So after GST, whether it is male or female, the small businesses started to stagnate. So they were the ones who found it more difficult to get into this system and to adjust to this system. So I think now we can take a natural break because then now we'll go into the same thing, but in terms of inequality, the differences between men and women, right? In a sharper fashion. So can you just stop recording?
I have a question before that.
Yes, sure.
So, ma'am, here you had explained that. So there's a sentence on page number 4 that the large businesses had a relative advantage during demonetization.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you give the reasons for that? I'm sure there are 1 or 2 obvious reasons, but can you elaborate?
Yes, there is a reason. The reason is that when demonetization happened, what they did was they took away all the currency. All the currency in the hand became irrelevant, right? So who are the people who are able to survive? So even just look at you and me and the people in the country as a whole. All of us who had internet banking, all of us who were able to manage without having to deal with cash, all of us who had credit cards didn't really have a problem. It is the people who are handling cash, who are doing their businesses on cash. The cash disappeared from the system. The people from whom they take business and the people who are their customers, they're also at the lower level who are also dealing in cash. So we were a very cash-based economy at the time of demonetization. Now we are much more, after pandemic, we have become much more digital payments. Like you see, all this Google Pay and UPI and all that has become very popular even among the street vendors after the pandemic, when that whole touch problem arose. But during the demonetization time, it's like 80% of the business in this country was running on cash. So the people now, why did the self-employed big businesses manage to survive? Because they, for one thing, they were on, they were doing internet transactions or NEFT or whatever it is to make their transactions. So in that sense, their business was not affected. They were not all that black money thing. What was one of the purpose was to get all the black money back in. It didn't kind of work. So that money became poor. I mean, that money went away, or they were able to put it back into the bank, or whatever happened to that. So the large businesses, because they were more financially included, because their financial transactions were more likely to be digital already, and also because they probably were able to manage the banks better, because we had this, you can take only so much of money from the bank at a time and so on. There were rules like that, remember? So it is possible that they were able to do that. They had more accounts, they had more contacts with the bank. So if they needed cash, perhaps they were able to manage it better. But the main thing is financial inclusion. The financial inclusion of the financial, meaning their digital bank transactions and so on, of the big businesses was much more, much more than the small businesses. The small businesses were dealing with cash, and it was the cash which was withdrawn from the economy. And that is the reason why the large business were able to. In the case of GST, it is simply that they were able to adjust to that system faster. They also had, professional support to be able to do it. So they were already engaging child accountants, and so on. These small businesses run without accountants. Just the owner of the firm himself manages everything. So to be able to then manage the GST system, the registration into it, and all the procedures involved in it, that made these self-employed smaller businesses lose out. Yeah, good question. All right, so then can we stop for a while now?
Ma'am, I have one more question before we proceed.
Yes.
So, ma'am, in one of the graphs regarding women workforce, there were those 4 graphs that you had presented. So, in that, the women participation from Kerala is very low.
Yes.
So, and it's a very developed state. So, it's a highly developed state. So, I wanted to know the reasons for it.
Yeah, it's also very developed, and we also think that women in Kerala have better mobility and social status and so on. Yeah. I really don't have an explanation for that, particularly because it is a Kerala-based, it is a rice-based region as well. Though, of course, agriculture in Kerala has gone down quite a bit. So it is a question of non-agricultural jobs. And it is not an industrialized state. So that may be one of the reasons. And the women are all highly educated. Educated, definitely, and highly educated. So maybe their reservation wage is high, and so they don't participate in activities which are not coming up to their standards. But yes, it cannot explain that fully. Yes.
I'm also thinking that in the state of Kerala, which is for the Chinese students, it's one of the southernmost states and a very highly developed one. It could be that there is so much out migration from Kerala.
Yes.
That a large part of the labor force is actually working outside. So they don't come into the statistics of the government.
Yeah, also, I think you've got a good point there, because a lot of the migration, if they are not nurses and, in the medical profession, because nursing is a very, a large proportion of people go for nursing and they travel abroad for that, women, I mean. But in the other cases, it is the men who go to the West Gulf countries of United Arab Emirates and so on. So the women are left behind, but then they get this earnings from the men, the earning remittances. So, Kerala is known as a remittance economy. That is the amount of money coming back from other countries on a regular basis. They say that, the statistics show that 30% of the SDP, that is the state domestic product, comes from remittances. So that might also explain the lower female labor force participation, because the regular income is there in the household, but it will not be recorded as coming from women's work, or even for that matter from men's work. That could be also one of the reasons why it is. But then we have to see, yeah, of course, I think migration to the Gulf countries started quite early. So last 30 years or so, we've been having that migration to Gulf countries. So we won't see. I was thinking that if it is more recent, then you will see that variation, but it's not there. Of course, during the pandemic, there was a problem in the sense a lot of those people came back because of the fact that a lot of industries closed there as well. So a lot of those people came back. So now they are a remittance economy and very much dependent on this income coming from other countries, mostly the Arab countries. Good. So shall we go on? Okay. So far we were looking at differences in employment, wage and self-employment, and differences in income and wages over this period, and basically trying to see whether these two economic shocks that we had of these two events in November 2016, which was a demonetization event, and the other event in July 2017, which was the introduction of the new tax regime, the GST system, whether that affected men and women differently, whether it affected white collar and wage workers differently, and whether it affects small businesses and large businesses differently. So that is what we were looking at so far. So now just the last few slides on looking at inequality. So we did see that male and female wage differences between among white collar workers and non-agricultural workers, that is the high level professional workers and non-professional workers, right? So this is just a ratio of the male wage to the female wage, or the male income to the female income during that same period. And as we saw that this lower curve is actually the white collar workers. But unlike what we thought, it is, so the increase in the wage gap between men and women is quite high and increasing in the white collar workers, more so than in the normal workers, the other workers, the lower salaried workers. But when we thought that this wage gap is higher, it is not true. If you look at it, the wage gap is higher actually in the lower income workers. That is, it is like 1.5. That means the male wage is 1.5 times higher than female wage. And here the male wage was one time higher, and it goes up to 1.5. The other one is going up to 2. So in absolute terms, the gap between the two is higher among the lower income wage workers than among the white collar workers. But if you look at the change after the events that we are talking about, that is, this first red line is the demonetization, and the second one is the other event, GST event. So you see this increasing, the rising wage differences for both male and female, but more so in the case of wage workers, it is fluctuating. A widening gap for wage workers, but less sharp and fluctuating. In the case of white collars, it is a widening gender gap. So again, the explanation that I was trying to give you last time, which I've written here again, is that the chances that the male workers in the top jobs are retained and the female workers in slightly lower level wage white collar jobs are thrown out are higher. I was just giving you the example of a university which might face a crisis if we get fewer students. Then what would the university do? Or any other economic activity, any other enterprise, they would try to retain their core activity workers and try to get rid of all peripheral staff. And invariably, it turns out that the core activity people are the white collar people, and they're also the higher salaried people as compared to the peripheral jobs, which can be casual. It can be, you hire somebody to do a task. So those kind of people lose their jobs much faster than the people who are doing the core activities. Now, this is the same thing. The income of self-employed people, the large businesses. This light gray line is the male income to female income of self-employed large businesses, and the lower line is the male to female of small businesses. So here we had seen that male and female gap is higher in large businesses. It was hugely higher in large businesses before the two shocks. But after the two shocks, the male businesses and female businesses, the difference between the male business and the small female business among both the large ones and the small ones somehow seems to have declined. So if you look at the female gap is higher in large business, the difference was stagnant till September, but then after 2016, the inequality in the large businesses rose. And why did that inequality increase? That inequality could increase if the larger businesses, which were more stable, were able to withstand the shock of demonetization, and again this shock of the GST, whereas among the large businesses, the weaker ones would lose out. So in terms of income, if you look at it, that income gap between men and women is the differences were stagnant, and the inequality rose because the large businesses were able to this gray one. But that is at the time of demonetization. But when it came to the GST, that's a slightly different trend. So gender inequality in small businesses actually drops. So if you see this period between the GST and the demonetization, in small businesses, that difference between men and women actually dropped. This could be because the male businesses drop out and the female businesses remain. So the male businesses suffered more than the female businesses. We can't actually explain this fully. And in the case of both small and large, there's a huge fluctuation after these two events, which is understandable. So while things were moving very smoothly till the GST event, till the demonetization event, the small businesses were the differences between men and women in this large businesses were fluctuating, and similarly in the case of the female. So the going in and out of businesses or the fluctuation in the businesses of both men and women in the large businesses and the small businesses, things became more uncertain, basically, where things were moving very smoothly here before these two shock events, and then that changes. So you have an increasing inequality, and then later on you see a decreasing inequality between men and women. The decreasing inequality in men and women could mean that the male businesses are suffering more than the female businesses. Maybe they are bigger. Right. Now, this is the same thing, except that this gives it to you in one thing. So what is a Kuznets ratio? All economics people would have heard of it. Kuznets ratio is a measure of inequality. And a Kuznets ratio is basically trying to say what is the share of income on the top 20% of the. So if you arrange the income of all businesses or all households or whatever you're looking at in ascending order or descending order, then the top 20% of businesses, what is their income, their share of income as compared to the bottom 20%. That is the inequality. So if the share of the top 20% is going up, then if this share is going up, this is called a Kuznets ratio. If this is going up, it means that the inequality is increasing. What does it mean? It means that the share of the top 20% is rising as compared to the share of the bottom 20% over a period of time, right? So here you have a Kuznets ratio for total income, that is wage and self-employed income together, right? So you see that the Kuznets ratio is among, so the top 20% is gaining. If you see this rising, both are rising actually, but female questions ratios is less so. The top 20% had more than 3 times. So this ratio is the ratio of what the 20% of the top has compared to the 20% at the bottom. So the 20% at the top has 3 times more income than the 20% at the bottom, right? This is a classic inequality thing, which, there's this, I don't know whether people have heard of Thomas Piketty. In 2014, he came out with this book about inequality in the world over, and he notices this hugely increasing, rising inequality across the world. So one of the ways to measure that is this Kuznets ratio. It's the simplest measure of inequality. So the top 20% of the whoever is earning an income is all male workers, is 3 times higher than the bottom 20% in the beginning. And this fluctuates quite a bit. And then here, this fluctuation you're seeing in October 17, that is slightly after the GST, which was in July 17. And then you see this, it rises all the way up to March 18. And then you see a slight drop and an increase. So broadly, there is this increasing trend in male ratios. Female ratio is also seeing this huge rise. And then after 17, you're seeing that decline. So 20% had 3 times more income. Male inequality was constant at 3 up to the shock of demonetization in December 16. And then after that, the inequality rises sharply. Better off wage and self-employed. Again, the reason we are saying that the better off people in wage and self-employed were able to manage the shock or lose work less, and so on. Female inequality fluctuated about 3 times 3 and also rises after 2016 till May 2018. So this is a simple thing of total income. So now we look at the same ratios for white collar and wage workers. So we had noticed this, where did it go now? Yeah, these are the female white collar workers on top. The next one are the male white collar workers. And then the bottom 2 are the wage workers. And this is similar to the graph we saw earlier, except that here we are seeing it as a ratio of the top 20 to the bottom 20. Earlier, we were looking at it as a ratio of the male wage versus the female wage, right? So now we are looking at it in terms of among white collar workers, people who are on top, share of the top 20% to the bottom 20%. So there is this very, very strong rise, particularly for female, but that rise, that means the better off among the women white collar workers were doing even better than the not so better off female white collar workers. And that advantage to the female white collar workers went on till around November 17. And after that, that advantage seems to have sort of declined. Wage inequality is greater in the better. And okay, if you look at the amount, it's like 10 times, 8 to 10 times, 8 to, it goes up to 16 times. So the better off women workers were 8 times better off than the worse off women workers. It goes up to 16 times. That differential in the shares of income went up to 16 times. That kind of huge difference is not there among the male workers. The male workers have a slightly, like it's about 6 times more, and it goes up to like 7, 8 times more, the top 20 as compared to that stark difference is there among the female workers, but not so among the male workers. And it kind of steadies after all these events after January 2018 or November 2017. So wage inequality among women white collar workers rise 8 to 16 times and rises sharply after November 16. Wage inequality increases less sharply for men, which is from 6 to 8 times. And male wage workers have the lowest inequality of wage workers. That is this bottom line. Yes.
So I have a question. Although it's very clear that the inequality works in this pattern, that it seems to be less actually for women, according to what you have explained. But I wonder if women can also exit the workforce and enter the workforce maybe more frequently than men do. And that could be a reason why you have these dips or other, maybe it's not a dip so much, it's less sharp. the inequality?
No, the inequality among women in the white collar is more sharp. This topmost curve is
Okay.
a female white collar workers have a much sharper increase in inequality than.
Yeah.
But your point about entry and exit is true in the sense that once this that we have not shown that here, we have papers on that when the after demonetization, the men were able to re-enter the labor force, not just ours. A lot of papers are showing that the men were more likely to re-enter the labor force than the women. And also, you remember that wage employed, self-employed graph right up in front that we had looked at. You see the men, if I can go to that, it's way up. This one. So if you see this two lines in the middle are wage self-employed and male. This is the male wage employed and this is the male self-employed. So here we are not making the distinction between white collar and other workers. What we are seeing is that when the men are losing their wage jobs, they are somewhere gaining in self-employed jobs. So, and then they come down to similar. So here what we are saying is that they are somehow able to adjust in some fashion. Either they join somebody else's business or they try to start their own small enterprise or something like that. So this is just employment. It doesn't mean income. So, yeah. So that is again what we are seeing here. Where were we now? Achha, we did this. Yeah, we were looking at this. Right? So that entry and exit story we are not telling here, but it is possible that women were less likely to enter the workforce. There's another thing also we had found that, and that was in the case of the pandemic. Okay, that's a different paper and it was about the pandemic. Anyway, let's not confuse the issue now. All right, and so now our couple of last slides is actually this is the same thing, but this is for large and inequality in large businesses and small businesses. So here we have male self-employed businesses. This is the large businesses and female large businesses. So now we are looking at the share of male large businesses, female large businesses, male small businesses, and female small businesses. So now female large businesses had a much higher difference right in the beginning. So like 10 times. So the share of the big businesses in the top 20% was 10 times higher than that of the bottom 20%. But that continuously declined. And then after there was the sharp decline during the demonetization. And then after that, there's a slow rise again. So the inequality between women's businesses, small and big, was very large in the beginning. It sort of tapers off and starts to then again begin to rise. Now let's look at the male large businesses. Male large businesses seeing a lot of fluctuation. It is this triangle thing. And there is this, again, declines during this thing period. And there's a lot of fluctuation basically. Small businesses also, this is an exception. I can't explain this very big rise of female small businesses and then this huge drop of female small businesses. There's something wrong there. Small businesses also. Basically, what we are seeing is a lot of fluctuation in the shares of the top and the bottom, but the differences remain. So female large and small businesses were more unequal than men. It was 10 to 7 times higher among the top. And the gap in inequality of male and female larger businesses reduced first and after the first shock, that is after demonetization. That seems to decline. So you see this graphs hugging each other. And then after the GST shock, the differences between the better off businesses and the not so better off businesses in all the categories seems to go up, which basically means that the better segments of whether you're in small business or in large business is able to withstand or able to adjust better to a shock, and particularly to a shock which is something like a GST, right? So ultimately, when we'll sum up now. Yeah. Okay, to sum up. So we had one issue that we wanted to flag, which we've done in a very, very detailed way, which is what are the issues and challenges for women, right? So one of the biggest issues is, of course, what we saw right up in front, very low female labor force participation. So there are studies which say that in any average Asian country, if all these women are able to work, given their qualifications and all, your GDP will go up like 20 to 30%. So there's a huge loss, not just to the women, there's a huge loss to the economy when women are not working in such large numbers. So low female labor force participation is one of our biggest problems. And we still haven't figured out how. Of course, there is also this whole story that maybe we are undercounting the women working and all that. We might be undercounting, but we might undercount by 10%, by 20%, but we're definitely not undercounting by 50%. When you have a female labor force participation in urban areas, which is closer to 10, 12, 15. So you can raise it by 10%, 20%, 30%, you'd still only reach 30% participation. The other 70% is not participating. So, okay, so we went on these, couple of huge shocks that we had. We're not talking about the third shock. We've got a third shock, which is the pandemic, which also created tremendous fluctuations in the labor market, both in terms of employment and in terms of incomes. So when it looks at jobs, both male and female workforce, total male and female work participation dropped and unemployment rose. But overall, the losers were in terms of jobs, the wage and white collar workers, as compared to the self-employed. Somehow the self-employed seemed to, the employment and self-employment kind of tended to rise. But the incomes, real mean wages rose, partly due to loss of the lower order jobs. The overall average wage, we saw that rising. Maybe because, like I said, it is the people who are fired are the people who have the lower levels of salaries. So when you come to the average, which is basically the total income divided by the number of people, that goes up, the mean goes up. Then there is a widening wage gap between the white collar workers. Particularly, there's a gender gap in the white collar workers, and income from large businesses rose. After both the shocks, male small businesses income rose after demonetization, but dropped after GST. So now the explanation for this is what I've been saying, that the large businesses have been able to better adjust to both the shocks, and particularly to the second shock of demonetization, second shock of complying with the new tax systems. They were more easily able to comply with the tax systems as compared to the smaller businesses, which were completely at sea. For one thing, they were cash-based, so they were affected by that. Second, they were, they're all very small enterprises. They have one person who's the owner or the top person there, and he handles everything from accounts to sales to everything. So to be able to do this extra thing of registering for this GST and following all their protocol, which includes having receipts for everything. Because a lot of these activities, economic activities in India happen without a receipt. That is, they almost, it becomes black actually. But so in the case of GST, every single voucher, every single invoice has to be uploaded on the government system of the goods and services tax. Now the companies have, after now this data here stops at 2018, but now you can read in the newspapers that the GST, the amount of money coming in on GST has risen in a very big way, which also means that more and more companies have been able to comply with the GST regulations and are paying up their taxes. So on inequality, there are huge gender wage gaps, and there's a widening gender wage gap for white collar workers. Partly, one explanation could be that the male top workers are retaining the female top workers, being still at a lower level of skills and economic activities happening in the company are more likely to be fired. So the widening gap in the wage work, but less sharp and fluctuating. Male-female income gap is larger in the large businesses. Given the shock, after the shocks, macro shock, after demonetization shock, the gender inequality in the large businesses rose. The stronger male businesses were able to withstand demonetization, and they were also able to withstand the GST shock. And finally, the Kuznets ratios, which was the share of the top 20% within any category as compared to the bottom 20% in any category. So the female large and small businesses are seen to be more unequal than the male, and that inequality also rose. So like the better off businesses among women businesses were like 8 to 10 times higher than that of the small businesses. The gap in the businesses and income inequality in male and female in large small businesses, they reduce after the first demonetization, but then the second one hits this difference between men and women and large and small businesses. That is the GST. So demonetization broadly reduced inequality in business incomes. It is possible that the larger male businesses shrank more as compared to the small female businesses. The smaller female businesses probably smaller and were able to hold on to some extent, whereas the larger male businesses, the total amount of activity that they could do shrank very highly. And GST made the larger businesses stronger. They were able to adapt faster, and the smaller businesses suffered. Broadly, if we look at it as an issue and challenge for women workers, being in business is a challenge. Being able to do it, being able to participate in it for women is a challenge. Being able to get finances is another challenge. But major challenge comes if there is a shock. They are very, very badly affected, women businesses, and not only women businesses, women workers also, if there is a shock, and they are able to recover much slower as compared to the male businesses. I think with that, I end. Yeah. So broadly, that is what it is. I hope it was not too complicated and too many variables there to play with.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe Asta could prepare a short note on demonetization and GST. So it becomes very clear
Yes,
to
yes.
those who are not part of the same history.
Yes,
To be done.
that's right. And then I think somebody should explain that or read that out and explain it.
We could circulate it beforehand as well.
Circulate it beforehand, right?
A question.
Because otherwise, what could be the, I'm saying that this thing is happening, but they don't really know what the event was. That's possible.
So maybe like a little more explanation about what was involved and what was the result. So I have a question actually including all of these.
Yeah. Sure.
You talked about, and the bulk of your presentation is about the two major shocks to the economy and how it affected male and female workers or employers, etc. So, and you did say there was a third shock to the economy, which was the pandemic or COVID-19.
Yes.
But I somehow feel that out of these three, the first two, demonetization and GST, actually interfered with the existing arrangement of taxes, incomes, keep accounts, and all that. The pandemic is a natural disaster. It doesn't.
Yes.
It's not an economic event.
Yes.
But it has economic effects, I guess, right? So I just wondered whether one needs to make a difference between these three shocks, that the first two are actually economic in nature and the third one isn't, although it is having its own effects on the economy. That was one. But let me ask you a question, which is surely what happened to the pandemic, and this is, we know anecdotally, that the nature of work changed. Whereas in GST and demonetization, people come back to the same business. They're not changing the nature of their work. So I wondered if you had thoughts on this.
So, the first shock of demonetization, when they withdrew this huge amount of cash, which was almost 80% of the entire cash currency in circulation in the country, it was a tremendous damage to, because all economic activity just simply stopped. Because if you withdraw so much of the cash from the economy, it just stops. It came back, but it took a few months to come back. So in India's pandemic, the pandemic itself is okay, everybody had a pandemic. But the problem with India's immediate reaction to the pandemic was that stringent lockdown that we had. It was 100% lockdown. So if you look at stringency index on the net, if you look at that, we are about the only country which did 100% lockdown for 2 months. Whereas no other country did that. I mean, they did they would have, if they had complete lockdown, it was for a few days. Otherwise, it was restrictions on movement, time, something of that kind. So that complete lockdown had the same effect as withdrawing cash from the economy to the extent that it completely closed all economic activity. That is why in India we saw that huge migration of the workers, what I'm calling those wage workers. They were migrating because all the businesses had closed down, all the economic activity closed down. So it was almost similar to withdrawing all the cash from the economy. The GST is different. It's because of that lockdown. Okay, that 2 months of that to lockdown. If we had done it for 10 days, 15 days, it would have been different. But that 2 months of lockdown did tremendous damage to the economy. So a lot of businesses just simply collapsed. Then the pandemic had another problem. The pandemic had this problem that the touch industries, any industry which needs people to stand in front of each other or touch each other, like health, of course, the pandemic side was working, but anything else, like, for example, physiotherapy or anything else which can be delayed, lost. Retail front, face-to-face retail lost. All tourism went away, all hotels closed down. So, restaurants business lost. So certain sectors lost hugely in the case of the pandemic because of the touch thing. Whereas in the demonetization, everybody lost equally. Whichever industry was holding a lot of cash and were completely cash-based transactions, they lost. In the case of the GST, the people that were really affected were the businesses. And because the businesses closed, the wage workers are affected if they closed. But it was the businesses which were affected because they had to register for this system. And another thing that happened with GST is that why this difference between the large and small, why the large is able to what I'm saying, that they were able to withstand the shock. What happens is that in this system, whoever is giving a contract to another person, which is generally the large is giving the contract to the small person, they can get a refund. It's called an input credits or something like that. So for whatever is done by the lower level subcontractor, the larger subcontractor gets input credits for that. And so he says he doesn't have to pay that amount of tax. In order to do that, this smaller guy who has taken the contract has to provide receipts. And those receipts have to be uploaded on this GST system. So all the invoices, all the receipts have to be uploaded for the larger contractor to be able to get the advantage of the input credit. When that happens, the smaller fellows, first and foremost, are not able to register in that system. Once they register in the system, most of the people they work with don't give receipts. So they don't have receipts to upload. In that process, what has happened in the GST is that the lot of the smaller contractors and smaller subcontractors, because most of them don't have their own, they may be doing manufacturing, but they don't have any their own manufacturing. Somebody is giving them work, they're giving them raw material, and they're just doing that thing and giving it back to them. That's what most of our small manufacturing is doing. So those people who were not able to provide the receipts, they no longer got contracts from the larger enterprises. So that is how the smaller fellows lost out in the GST. Because that whole relationship, the value chain. So as the value chain, you go down, it goes down, down, down to the informal sector, the very small enterprises. All those fellows get thrown out. They all lost their jobs and their business because the larger fellows no longer wanted to give them a subcontract because they are not able to get the credit back in the GST. That is how the system is affecting the lower chain in the subcontracting system. So the smaller fellows who are unable to provide these requirements, they lose their contracts. The larger fellows stop giving them contracts until they are able to again get back into the system, register and so on. But then they have lost it. That is the mechanism of impact of GST on the difference between what happened to the large fellows and what happened to the small fellows.
So I have another slightly related question, which is we always read everywhere that the bulk of India's economy is an informal economy. And if the GST and the figures that we have about work and income, and subsequently the conclusions we can draw about inequality, are they, how will they be skewed, or how will they be how will they look different if you're able to count informal workers? I mean, are they completely under the radar, or do they come into these statistics?
No, they're very much counted. There'll be a very small section of the informal workers who are not counted. They are counted. It can be that some of the women who are working at home and do not report themselves as working because of all our social and cultural norms and whatnot. It's not, I mean, the stigma is attached to people going out to work. So because of that, people might not be reporting themselves as work. Otherwise, all informal work should be captured. We have good enough systems to capture them, because we're doing household surveys, right? The labor force surveys, which has been used here, is a household survey. So they go to the household and they ask for each individual in the household what are the economic activities that they are doing. Now, the chances of women not reporting that they are working is higher. And that's why the female labor force participation goes down. But otherwise, it doesn't matter whether they are formal or informal. Whatever work they're doing, they will report it. They will report themselves as that wage casual workers as compared to the higher level salaried white collar workers and so on. The only other thing could be that if they have seasonal work, then there is a major time criterion attached to this. So you should have been working for more than 6 months to be counted as a worker. So if there are people who are getting only 3 months work in a year or 4 months work in a year or something like that, then they might get missed out. So that to that extent, some of the informal workers might drop out of that thing. But it is not, I mean, it's not that they don't capture informal workers. Otherwise, we won't get these kind of estimates because 80% anyway are informal.
So other parallel question is only paid work counted, or because women might work in unpaid fashion in family-based units?
Yeah. So unpaid workers are counted. If you remember the first couple of slides that I showed, where I showed the categories within the wage and within the self-employed. And the self-employed, there's a third category which is called unpaid contributing family members. So they are very much counted. So you have an employer category which is extremely small. About 4% of the people, self-employed people, report as employer. Majority of them are this own account workers. And then the majority of the women are what they report as this unpaid family worker. So they are counted. The only thing is that the possibility that women are undercounted is definitely, so many times larger than men being undercounted. And that's partly because of our cultural norms. This also maybe one of the reasons why our South Indian states and Western states are getting higher female labor force participation. Because women are more likely to report themselves as working. Because if that's not a stigma, like in Gujarat, when we did those surveys of these home chefs and all that, everybody's really happy to report that they're working because it is seen at business, and working in a business is seen as a positive thing. Whereas if you go into Bihar and UP, Uttar Pradesh and people like that, then it is possible that women don't report some kind of activities that they might be doing. So that's a general problem for women workers, not so much for informal workers as such. The problem, why it becomes significant for informal workers, is because a large proportion of women are home-based workers working at home. So their chances of not reporting goes up. That's the reason why that might be an underestimate there.
Thank you so much.
Right.
This has been a very interesting session. And if there are any questions that come back from the general class, we'll of course send it to you for your response. Sure.
And I'll respond to them after that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Astha. And I hope you enjoy I hope the students enjoy the sessions. All right. Okay. Bye then. See you.